works only if they actually distribute many copies of this video. So these videos are all wrapped in Creative Commons licenses, which say, please copy and distribute me as broadly as you can for non-commercial purposes and without making changes, because more copies here for the artist means more money. That's one example. Here's a second, not a Creative Commons example, but illuminating the point. My favorite band right now in the United States is a band called Wilco. One of their very best albums is this album called Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. Yankee Hotel Foxtrot was originally to be released on a different label from the one that eventually released it. When Wilco brought the album to their label and said, here's our greatest work ever, the label said, we don't like it. You'll have to change it. And Wilco said, we love it, we're not going to change it. And the album said, well, we're not going to release it. And Wilco said, fine, give us the rights back. So Wilco was given the rights back, and then they released the album for free on the internet under terms equivalent to our non-commercial license. This led to an extraordinary spread of this content across the whole internet, and a buzz as this spread increased. Extraordinary excitement about this album. So much excitement that a different record album company bought the rights back from Wilco to release this in a traditional CD way, indeed spending 3 times the price that Wilco had originally been paid for the album. So then they released the album in the traditional CD way, even though it was available for free on the internet, and the question they were interested in was, what would this do to the sales of Wilco albums? Well, the fact is, Wilco sold more albums from this than they had ever sold in the history of their releases. They succeeded here by being more balanced with the rights associated with their content. Or, outside of the context of arts, there's this South African research council called the Human Sciences Research Council, which has about 250 researchers in 12 different research programs. For all of the history of this council, their business model was researchers would produce books and they would sell those books. 2001, they decided to stop this practice. And instead, they would make all of their books available for free electronically. So you could download any of the HSRC books across the internet for free. And then they would give a simple option. If you would like, they would sell a print-on-demand version of the book. So you could get it for free, but if you wanted to buy a printed version, clicked and you got a printed version sent to you. 4 years later, they evaluated the sales of books, the effect of this change in strategy on their sales. Remember, before everything had to be bought, now everything was free with an option to buy. Between 2001 and 2005, sales of HSRC books went up by 300%. For obvious reasons. Nobody was going to buy a book from South Africa unless they knew something about it. They wouldn't know anything about it unless they could see it. They could see it if it's electronically available for free. Many people, after they see this is research they want, don't want to read a book on a computer, then decide to buy it, and that's what leads to this increase in sales. So here again, more balanced, less restrictive, control of the rights actually benefited the underlying creator. And so many people decide to use Creative Commons licenses then because it helps them in spreading their work in the way they want their work spread. But a second group of creators use Creative Commons licenses not because it's a good idea to help spread their work and make more money, but because they believe it's right to use the licenses for their form of creativity. And here, the most important community is a community that lives under a very important ethic, the scientific community. The ethic, which is, in my view, an obligation all scientists share, not just to discover great new knowledge, but to make their work accessible universally to anybody around the world, regardless of whether they're privileged enough to be in a rich American university. But the general problem with science right now is that some of the most important scientific journals are so expensive that the articles published in those journals are accessible only in the richest American universities. And so the objective of many scientists is to find a way to make their work accessible universally because they don't intend to make money from their articles. They intend to advance knowledge from their research. This objective is what's supported by a sister project of Creative Commons called the Science Commons Project, which aims to enable scientists in all sorts of contexts to eliminate the unnecessary obligations of the law to facilitate what is their underlying ethical obligation. Now, this spread, which they seek, of knowledge and of learning, comes in part from a recognition that as scientists, as academic scholars, as individuals participating in the creating and sharing of our culture, a recognition that not all creativity is governed by the same business model that governs creativity coming from these hills. Right? Not all creativity depends upon perfect control over the distribution of that culture. Instead, many creators, many producers of knowledge depend upon something different, a more balanced system of protection. And increasingly, we all as creators need to recognize a certain environmentalism as it applies to culture. Because there's an ecology for culture just as there's an ecology for the environment. And that ecology depends on we taking only the rights that we need. The rights that we need for the particular control that's necessary for how we intend to profit or spread our work. But leave the rest in the commons, so that others can build and spread that work as they see fit. That's the ecology that a culture depends upon. That's the environmentalism we need to return to our cultures. Now, as we look at this creativity, as we recognize the capacity which is increasingly being deployed by our children, we should recognize that there's no way to kill this creativity. We can only criminalize it. There's no way to stop our children from using technologies in this way. We can only drive it underground. There's no possibility that our kids will be as passive as my generation was. The only thing we can do is make them, quote, pirates. And the question we should be asking as cultures around the world is whether this war to make our children pirates is good. Whether it's good for them or good for our cultures. We live in the United States especially in this weird age of prohibition, where we live life constantly against the law. The very activities of ordinary life are constantly against the law, and our children in particular grow up violating the law in all sorts of contexts, thinking to themselves, I violate the law because the law is an ass. And this practice, this way of life, is corrosive. It is corrupting of the rule of law. There is no excuse in a democracy for this gap between what ordinary people believe makes sense and what the law says is the rule. That gap creates an obligation for us, an obligation that the law reflect values and that we make the law reflect our values. So what are these values for us? Are they the values of this passive, read-only culture? Or do they include also the values of this extraordinarily productive read-write culture? Can we imagine ever going back to this? Is there a way we can see to produce this as a possibility? Is there a way to imagine encouraging both here? Through balanced regulation and practices that seek primarily to encourage what we should recognize as a kind of literacy for the 21st century. And this literacy is important not just for this practice of remix. It's important for the explosion of ways that people have found to use digital technologies to participate and to change their culture.